If you're a reader of ethnic books, books about women, or books by local authors, you may be familiar with the writings of Nora Okja Keller. But even if you aren't, you'll be delighted to hear Nora's stories about finding identity and a voice through writing. Aloha no, I'm Leslie Wilcox of PBS Hawaii. Mahalo for joining me for another Long Story Short. Please join me as I sit down with author Nora Okja Keller next.
Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, produced with Sony Technology, is Hawaii's first weekly television program produced and broadcast in HD. High definition, it's in Sony's DNA.
Nora Okja Keller, born to an American father and a Korean mother, has written two critically acclaimed and important novels, Comfort Woman and Fox Girl, based on the almost unspeakable experiences endured by Korean women during World War II and the lives of Korean Americans who came after them. Although Nora's stories are very dark, she herself is a personable, local Hapa girl with a supportive husband and two little girls.
You know, if I had read your books without having ever seen you or heard much about you, I would be expecting to come to this table today and to see somebody very dark with the mileage carved in her face, because you conjure up such brutal imagery and some difficult themes like abandonment. Where does that come from?
You know, I get that all the time. You know, people say, "Oh, I thought you were going to be like so dour and like intense," and I think writing allows me to express. We all have that duality, you know, the light and the dark, and I think in part writing is my outlet for that darkness. So that in the daytime, when I'm with my kids and I, go about my daily life, I can release that into the writing and live, very lightheartedly.
So by day in the sunlight,
yes,
you're
my
a happy
secret identity
mom with kids.
I know, I get people saying, "Oh, I thought you would write like children's books about, happy bunnies in the field or something."
And instead, it's
so they pick up something
violence.
like Fox Girl, thinking, "Oh, it's going to be a happy story about, fox and woodland animals." But instead, it's like, whoa. That was it's something that I do struggle with, and I think in part that's why I took a break after writing Fox Girl. The intensity of that was a tough one for me.
You are a nationally known author, but you've lived here how long?
I've lived here since I was 5. So I was born in Seoul, and then my family left Seoul when I was about 3, and we traveled a little bit through the U.S. and I arrived here when I was 5. My dad's from Ohio, so they went back there and they went through the Midwest, and then my mom was so unhappy, and especially this was in the 70s, so feeling very isolated, and she knew some of her friends had settled in Hawaii, and she just begged and begged, and they moved here, basically.
So she could feel more comfortable?
Find
How did
her
they
Korean.
get together? What's the story of your dad and mom?
See, I'm not quite sure. I've heard several different versions. My mom's a storyteller as well, and so I've heard one version that she was a famous singer in Korea and was singing at a club, and my dad saw her and fell in love. So that's one version. And then another version I got was that they had met in her village outside of Busan while he was there for the war, during the war.
What does he say? Does he have a version?
He just asks, "Well, what does your mom say?" Whatever she says, okay. And I go, "Well," he says, "Ask her."
And she had never been here before, but had heard it was a nice place to live?
Yes. Well, she had friends, and that her friends would tell her, "Oh, you have to come visit, come try it out, live here for a little bit." And so that's what she did. She ended up staying, but my dad they ended up divorcing, and he's now living in New York.
I see.
And she loved it because she found like a community. And since then, she remarried and moved to Seattle. But she never found that community in Seattle. And since her husband passed away 2-3 years ago, she's moved back, and she's reformed the friendships that she's had for 30 years here. And so this has really been the place that she calls home.
And yet we don't really have a large Korean population. It wasn't that, was it?
No, but But my mom has a lot of, she's very gregarious, and so.
Are you that way too? Are you very social?
I am to a certain extent, but not as much as my mother. I definitely like to have my my alone time, and I think most writers do. You know, you need that time to reflect and to think and to kind of exist in this other world that you're creating. And to do that, you need some isolation, moments of quiet.
Is anybody allowed to intrude? Can your husband interact with you then?
My kids can sometimes, but my husband, no. I'm like,
Did you have periods in your life where you felt like you had to choose between your ethnicities?
No, not.
Or did you have difficulty feeling accepted?
Well, in adolescence, and maybe that's just a mark of adolescence, where we're all struggling against something and rebelling against something. And for me, it was being Korean, and partly because I didn't know very many other Koreans except for my mother's friends who were first generation. And I did go through a period as a teenager saying, oh, I don't want to be associated with anything Korean. You know, it's like, oh, nothing that my mom is, you know, I don't want to learn it. I don't want to learn the language. I don't want to eat the food. I don't want to.
Was that a mom thing?
I think in part that's a big thing. And so that's why I say maybe all adolescents go through that. But I would say, oh, like if people say, what ethnicity are you? And I'd say, oh, I'm a little bit of everything, you know.
You didn't have to choose sides?
I didn't want to choose. I said, I'm everything.
Nora Okja Keller has lived in different worlds from Seoul to Honolulu. Struggling with identity, she found her voice as an author. She began writing during her early school days at Alawai Elementary, Hahaione School, and Punahou. Today, Nora's works are translated into Korean and published internationally.
When did the writing bug hit you?
Oh, you know, I think I was always writing. Like, I remember scribbling little poems in elementary. I would start and I would do little poems, and I would read something and think, oh, that's so wonderful. And I would try to mimic the language in the book and think about how the writer, you know, put the words together to get that effect, to make it sound the way it did. So I was trying to do that even in elementary.
And were you also looking for a time alone to think about things like that?
Oh, I had time alone because I had to catch the bus home, and so that was my time alone, and I'd write, and then sometimes I'd get so involved I'd miss my stop and end up, you know, having to get, you know, call from the bus station for a ride home. But
do you remember what you wrote about in your early
oh,
years?
I think I wrote. I do. I wrote about kids I might have, you know, met, and I would form little stories around people, or I'd see something going on, like maybe somebody walking down the street, an older woman picking flowers or something. I might write a story about that, or animals. You know, I had lots of pets growing up. I grew up partly in Waimanalo, so we had quite a few dogs and cats running around. So I'd have little animal stories, things like that. And but you know, all that, when I look back, I think, well, of course I became a writer because I was doing it since I was a little kid. But all that time, I never thought, oh, I'm gonna grow up to become a writer. I'm gonna do this for my career.
That was never featured on Career Day, right?
Oh, never. And talking with my mom or my parents, it was like, well, no, try to, you know, do something practical, you know, have something that's going to support you for your life. You know, nobody's going to listen to you tell stories, you know, that's not going to, you're not going to.
Did they think you were a kind of an absent-minded or dreamy girl?
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, I missed my bus stop several times, you know, just daydreaming, and I'd be, you know, and my family would be having conversations, and I would be somewhere else, you know, thinking, about the characters that I was going to write about. So they say, of course, you know, you did that all the time, but that was never, I never considered it an option, you know, that I would become a writer.
So when you went to Punahou, what were you thinking in terms of what you were going to do and how you were going to do it?
Oh, when I was in high school, if anything, you know, I was drawn to arts, but the visual arts, so painting, drawing. I loved biology, so I thought maybe I could become that doctor my mom had always, you know, envisioned. That lasted until calculus. after calculus, I realized, no, I cannot
Back to
go
arts.
again. Back to the arts.
College?
UH, I got my undergraduate degree in English and psychology. And even there, I was not sure what I wanted to do. It wasn't until much later, I would say, really my 4th year, I took 5 years for that double degree, that I said, oh, well, I have enough credits for English. I might as well get a double major, along with psychology. I might as well add English to it.
Were your teachers not telling you, you're a writer, you should go
My
into
English
this?
teachers would say that, but, and I was always encouraged, like, oh, but it was more like maybe go into teaching or go into, and I was always encouraged with writing, like you were a good writer, but
How are you going to use it? What's the
yeah,
paycheck going to be?
it was like, well, what about law school, or what? How will this translate in the practical world?
What writers have you loved along the way?
When I was in high school, we had the classics, Hemingway, Faulkner, Steinbeck, and back then I was drawn to Hemingway for his, the very clean lines, the straightforward. Now I'm thinking, oh, I can't bear those, another war story and another manly man point of view. When I was in college, I took an Asian American studies course, and one of the people that we read was Maxine Hong Kingston. And that was actually the first time I read something I thought, oh, this is someone who has a background similar to mine, and we can write about this. We can write about stories that talk about ethnicity, and we can write about stories that talk about ghosts. It was a really a moment that I thought, oh, there's room for a voice like mine. And so she was a strong influence at that time in my life. Kathy Song, who I read in that class as well, and has been as a friend now, a big influence in my life.
So she influenced you as a writer, and then you got to know her, and she's your friend?
It's so funny because in that class, I remember going up to my professor after class one day and saying, well, I'm thinking about writing, and can you recommend are there any Korean Americans that we can read? Because we had read like Chinese American, Japanese American, Filipino American. There's very, the big ethnicities at that time, I guess. And so I said, is there any Korean Americans that I could look to as role models? She said, no. I went, I was shocked, and I didn't know what, I was like, oh, there's nobody for me to follow.
Did you find Kathy's Song on your own?
No, and the next day she said, oh, I was thinking, yes, there are, and in fact, Kathy's Song is one, but she's only half Korean. I said, that's okay,
So am I.
Yes, exactly. So then I read her works, Picture Bride, and I wrote part of my thesis on Kathy. And didn't meet her until after that, and now we end up. She's one of my best friends, and so it's fun how things kind of circle around.
Nora Okja Keller has found a small group of writers, including poet Kathy Song, with whom she feels comfortable sharing her work. And in Comfort Woman and Fox Girl, she was able to eloquently and vividly depict abandonment, abuse, survival, redemption. The term comfort woman is a euphemism from World War II, referring to a woman forced into sexual slavery.
When you wrote Comfort Woman, what kind of research did you do to find out these just horrible scenarios that happened?
Yeah, well, when I first heard about it in '93, there wasn't a lot of information on it. I had thought I knew a lot about Korean history and Korean culture because of my mom and her stories about growing up and just reading about it. But when I first heard about, and I heard about it through a symposium at UH, Kim Jo-hwang, a former Comfort Woman, came to speak there, and as she spoke, I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. This is such an important part of this history, and how come I didn't hear about this?
How come you didn't?
Well, I think in part, and I had asked this of my mom. You told me so much about this history, and you so much about culture, and I asked you for all these stories. Where are these stories about these women? And she said, well, it's such a painful thing to talk about for Koreans in general, I think, and for her generation that they just didn't speak about it. And even my older sister, who didn't leave Korea until she was a teenager. She said she remembers, like, there might be some reference, like, on this Korean soap operas, there'd be like this mysterious woman veiled in black going through the background, and the reference would be, oh, you know, do you see that woman? Something bad happened to her during the war. And so it would be understood but never talked about. And I think there was so much pain and so much shame surrounding that event. And Kim Jo-hwang said it herself, that so many of the women, well, the women who survived, you know, I've read statistics since then that maybe 90% of the women did not even survive the camps. But the women who did survive felt like they couldn't even return to their family, and they carried so much of that shame within them that they couldn't even speak about it, and they didn't talk about that part of their lives. And
what was the reality? What were the lives like of the Korean women who were taken captive and then forced to act as comfort women?
Well, there was probably, you know, 100, 200,000 women, Korean women, not to mention the Chinese women, the Indonesian women, the Filipino women. These were women between the ages of 11 or 12 and 35, 40 who were taken forcibly by the Japanese army, taken into small camps. And they were, in some cases, taken out of the classroom, taken away from families, and forced into these, you know, camps where they were kept to service the Japanese soldiers. So.
And what kind of hardships did they go through? They were raped.
Right, repeatedly. You know, forced to service maybe 30 to 40 men a day, abortions, and I think to add insult to all of that is that the women who survived these camps were treated as as invisible, you know, by the Japanese government afterwards, and you know, as non-existent, and that there were no camps. You know, that was the party line right after the war. Oh no, there was no such thing as these camps, and there was no such thing as these women. If these women were there, they wanted to be there. They volunteered. It was, you know, they did it to support the army. You know, it was that was the attitude. So I think maybe that was one of the most hurtful things for these women, and added to why it was so difficult for them to speak about their stories. You know, along with the shame, along with the trauma, is that they had to deal with, you know, the official line was they did not exist. Yeah.
So they didn't exist, or they had to define themselves as what awful things happened to them.
Right.
And you said most of them couldn't go home.
Yes, so many of them did not return to their families. So, you know, in their families' eyes, they were dead. They didn't return from the war, and the families might not have known what happened to them.
Why didn't they go home?
Kim Jo-hwang said because the girl that she was now dead, and that she could not bear to shame her family with what had happened to her.
That's one of the themes in both books. It's what it takes to survive, and how do you move on?
Right, how do you move on? How do you continue to form connections with other people? How do you continue to love? What do you pass on to the next generation?
How do you be open to other people when you've seen this just dastardly, horrible side?
Right. Exactly. So that's something that I circle back to again, and the strength and the fortitude that it takes to be able to do that, to not just give up and say, that's it. You know?
Well, in both of your books, I think your characters just put their minds in another place. They just detach from their body, which might work as a short-term strategy, but how does that affect them later in life?
Right. You know, I think there's always going to be a disconnect, that you are in some ways present for your children or the people in your lives, but there's always that part of you that is held back. And for something as horrific as that, those experiences in the prostitution and the comfort camps, it's not something that they would share with their children. So there's always something hidden and something withheld, and and that's a type of pain as well, you know, not to be fully open.
And if you do
people you
share,
love.
as your children might want you to, you've just given them just
Right,
terrible
a
images to
burden.
live with.
Right, you've passed on your burden. You know, some readers have come up to me and said, oh, you know, after I read, you know, Comfort Woman or Fox Girl, now I feel like I have this burden, you know. And I said, well, then I've done my job as a writer. You know, I
burden
felt
of
like I was
history.
carrying that. Yeah, I was carrying that burden writing it. So now, you know, you've read it, it's, you know, you share that burden.
What has your mom said about your taking up this burden of history?
Oh, you know, she's proud, you know, and one of the most moving things for me after Comfort Woman was written and published in Korean, I got to take my mom and my kids to Korea, and she hadn't been back for 25 years. And to be there when she was reuniting with some of her family that she hadn't seen for that long, and at the same time that my book was coming out, and it was just really, it was so moving, and to be able to share that with her. So I told her, the book's an apology for all the times that I said I wasn't Korean and I didn't want to, you know, participate in culture and wear the hanbok, you know, dress, and so we laugh about it now. And I was so blessed at that time.
And timing is good too, isn't it?
I think
There was a desire to see this material come out.
Yes, because that was just about the same time that the Comfort Woman first began speaking about it and first breaking their stories. You know, Kim Jo-hwang says she's talking about it now after all these years because before she died, she wanted this story to be known, this history to be known, and so I think a lot of the Comfort Women were coming forward with their stories at that time. The struggles that I portray in the book are so intense, and so, you know, most of us will never have to experience something, but we all go through our struggles, and we all strive for redemption. We all strive to make connections and to open ourselves up and to find that grace in life, and so I feel like that's just as important to write about.
You know, you said you showed chapters you'd written to fellow local writers, and of course you had an editor in New York. What's it like when, you know, these words are your baby and the crafting, it belongs to you, when somebody wants to change it? What's that like?
Well, first, I do a lot. I try to get my vision down as closely as I can on paper first before I can even bear to show it to somebody in my writing group even. But these are people I trust. And I know, like, they're such good people that I feel like I can trust them with my work, and that they're going to look at the work and say, this is what it needs, this is what I think needs to be done. Or even if anybody says, I don't like that, it's for the good of the piece. And I know it's always with the good intentions of how can we make this writing better. And in fact, when I teach classes, that's the attitude that I go in with. And I say, you know, it might seem like I'm going to write all over your paper and I'm going to say, this doesn't work here. But my intention is always, how can I make this piece better? How can I make something become what it should be, or closest to the vision that you have in your head?
So it's like artists or sculptors who start with a piece of stone or wood, and they say they're freeing something from that material.
I think in some ways, I always, you know, I started out thinking I was going to be, if I was going to be any artist, it would be in the visual arts, like drawing or painting. And so when I think of, you know, crafting a story or crafting a novel, that's kind of the terms that I think of it as, like, oh, a rough sketch, you know, doing the background wash, you know.
And what does it want to be?
Yeah, you know, what form is emerging from this, you know. So it is, that is somewhat, and trying to communicate that to my writing group first, and having another eye look at the piece and saying, well, this form is still a little bit hazy, you know, can you sketch it, you know, bring it forward a little bit, or this character should not be a background character, you need to make this character, bring him into the foreground, you know. So it does help. And so I've been so lucky to have people that I trust, you know, first reading it, being first editors for my work,
I think I remember you saying this is going to be a trilogy, and there hasn't been a third book yet.
I know.
What's the third book going to be about?
It will take place in Hawaii more so than the other two books, but still follow the theme of, Comfort Woman dealt with the Comfort Woman during World War II, Fox Girl, Korean War, but took place mainly in Korea. This next book will kind of jump forward another 20 years or so and reflect more Korean Americans in Hawaii.
So there's more to come from this talented writer, mining a rich, largely unexplored cultural vein, the Korean American experience in Hawaii. Mahalo to Nora Okja Keller for sharing stories, and to you for enjoying them with me. Please join me next week for another Long Story Short. I'm Leslie Wilcox of PBS Hawaii. Ahui ho kako.
Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox is produced in HD by PBS Hawaii with Sony technology. High definition. It's in Sony's DNA.
You've become a teacher part-time recently. What's that like, creative writing?
Oh, it's fun. And I've been teaching students younger than I've taught before, and it's so fun. It's something that I found that I really enjoy, and I enjoy teaching the younger students because they don't take themselves as seriously, I think, and they are more willing to take risks with their stories, and they're more willing to explore different things, and I find that refreshing, and it reminds me a little bit about what creative writing should be. A little bit of risk-taking, a little bit of exploration, a little bit of saying, I don't know what this is going to turn out to be, but I'm willing to go along with this story in the time being. So I just enjoy them. They're so funny.